All right, let's talk about the impact of homicide. So when we think about homicide, one term that's often used is homicide survivors. This term sounds as though we're talking about people who survived a homicide, but we're actually talking about family members and friends of homicide victims and the suffering that they endure. These are people who are not officially considered victims in the criminal justice system. Approximately 300 million people are in the U.S. and approximately 28% of homicide survivors. So sparse research on homicide survivors presents some unique problems for us. Or rather, there is sparse research on homicide survivors, and here's some of the unique problems they face. So oftentimes the press invites their privacy or portrays their loved ones in an unfavorable light. I'm sure you've all seen some media coverage where somebody is going up to victims and asking them how they feel, and it's pretty intrusive. Survivors have to contend with anger they have for the offender, and there's a lot of social stigma and isolation. Their experiences with the criminal justice system are often problematic. They feel ignored and pushed out of the case. Furthermore, the offender may not actually be punished. Many experience fear, guilt, rage, anxiety, and survivor's guilt, and even PTSD. PTSD is more prevalent in murder survivors than in people who lose loved ones to other causes. So if you have lost someone in your family to an accident, to suicide, to a medical illness, PTSD is less prevalent in that group. And trauma can manifest itself in physical symptoms. Also, the interpersonal relationships these people have are often affected by the murder of a loved one. They have a very complicated bereavement, and it's very difficult for them to reconcile their loss. Furthermore, it's not really clear what might be helpful to them. They may have medical bills to pay, they may lose income, it may be difficult to work and support oneself while trying to also attend any criminal justice proceedings. And as I mentioned a minute ago, the media is often insensitive when they question survivors. So victims' photos are broadcast on the news, the media may camp outside their houses. And furthermore, if the murder occurred in property that's owned by either the victim or someone in the family, they may actually have to pay in order to have the site cleaned up. So when we think about a crime, it's important to remember that the victim is just considered a witness, okay? Crimes are viewed as crimes against the state. Victims are traditionally not informed about the investigation, and some are also considered suspects. So this can often then, the whole process of the criminal justice system, increase someone's feelings of powerlessness. And the trauma often begins with when the person's notified of the death. The police, who mean well, may seem insensitive. And again, sometimes the media is the person who informs them of their loss, and they do so while asking intrusive questions. Plea bargaining, not guilty verdicts, and reduced sentences for good behavior because of overcrowding can also add to the helplessness and lack of control. Those who did experience a trial had higher rates of depression than family members whose cases were still unsolved. During the 70s, the victims' rights movement made a lot of advances. Feminists were able to make progress in terms of establishing battered women's shelters and encouraging rape shield laws. In 1976, victim impact statements begin to be used in the criminal justice system. In 1978, Parents of Murdered Children is formed. We also have the Victims of Crime Act, VOCA, which provides funding for victim assistance programs and state victim compensation. All of these changes improved how victims were treated. And so now victim compensation is commonplace. Most district attorneys' offices have victim assistance programs, and victim impact statements are routinely used in court. The first victim assistance program was in 1972 in St. Louis. And in 1974, the first government victim witness programs were established using funds from the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration. And basically the idea was here to provide a better experience for both witnesses of crime and victims. So now we take more care when we notify a survivor of the death of a loved one. Victims are also likely to be notified about updates in the state's case and maybe ask their opinions regarding the case. Victim assistance programs, too, often provide referrals to victims and inform them about compensation and counseling services that may be available to them. Victim compensation allows victims to be compensated for losses incurred during a crime, but usually this refers to victims who have suffered physical injury or emotional trauma. And this was originally proposed by Marjorie Fry in the 50s in England. The first programs in the U.S. appeared in 1965. Nearly 200,000 victims are helped per year at a cost of $450 million. It's funded through fees that offenders pay and fines and federal funding. So a homicide victim's family may receive funding for uninsured medical costs, funeral costs, crime scene cleanup, mental health counseling, lost wages, and support. But compensation is usually capped at $25,000. Victims assistance workers often make victims aware of and teach them and help them apply. Most programs, though, require someone to report to the police and cooperate with the investigation in order to be eligible to receive any funds. Every state in the U.S. also allows homicide survivors to present a victim impact statement at sentencing, and 44 states allow it as part of the pre-sentencing report. These can address not only financial suffering that's occurred as a result of the victimization, but also emotional suffering. A judge or jury may use these in determining the sentence. Usually they're presented orally in court. The victims will get up and speak and address the court, but many jurisdictions require them to be written in advance. Restorative justice is also used. Restorative justice has its roots in Native American and New Zealand customs. And the idea here is to repair the wrong done to the victim and community by bringing the offender, victim, and community members together. This encourages communication between offenders and those they hurt through victim-offender mediation. And the goal here is to allow the offender to repair the harm caused and to reintegrate him or her into society. It's also become important for them to recognize that they have caused pain. This also can give victims a voice and some control and be beneficial to them that way. It gives them an opportunity to tell the offender how their actions affected them and may even be cathartic. Victims often report that after mediation, they no longer see the offenders as monsters. They feel more at peace and they no longer feel the offender has any power over them. The Australian Institute of Criminology assessed the cost of homicide in Australia in 2001 to be $930 million. This includes costs of medical costs, loss output, and intangible costs. And intangible costs are, companionship and things like that. So in 2001, the U.S. had 13,752 homicides, and that would be at a cost of approximately $22 billion. This is less than the compensation paid to those impacted by 9/11. These studies also don't include criminal justice costs, which obviously can be very high as well. So in Tennessee, homicide investigations cost $14.2 million. Many also don't think about what happens to the murderer's friends and family experience. They experience many of the same issues and emotions. It's a lot of emotional stress, stigmatization. They too have insensitive media, loss of income, and loss of a loved one. Friends and families here often lose their loved one to either being incarcerated or suicide, and they also could lose income if they choose to attend the trial. If they're helping to provide a defense for their loved one, their finances may suffer as well. Oftentimes, society wants to hold the parent of murderers responsible for the offender's behavior. Finding out someone you love killed someone also is emotionally devastating, and it may be really difficult to find support. Violent crime also impacts those who work in the field, and in particular law enforcement, in particular homicide investigators. They may often feel it's their responsibility to solve murders and may experience nightmares and find that they're less trustful. Jurors in a trial can also suffer, may have difficulty sleeping, may find their thoughts drifting to details they heard at trial, and may be distraught about their decision. Crime stories dominated half of the newscasts monitored in 35 states for a 1990 study, and so the selling of murder and our focus on entertainment related to murder has desensitized us to the reality of it. So one thing we've heard about, or you may not have heard about, is what's called murderabilia. Okay, this is where people are selling things that are related to murder. So it's generally serial killer memorabilia sold by collectors, dealers, or killers themselves. Much of it is artwork like that of John Wayne Gacy. And basically this results because we've really glamorized crime in our culture. In 1977, the Son of Sam laws were enacted in New York to keep convicted killers like David Berkowitz from making money from the sales of stories about crimes they committed. So it doesn't prohibit you from selling your story, but instead requires that any profit has to be paid to the state for the benefit of crime victims. In 1991, SCOTUS ruled that New York's law was too broad, and it had applied to those accused but not found guilty of crimes. And it didn't distinguish between those that focused on the crimes and those that mentioned their crimes in passing. The court basically argued that Malcolm X and St. Augustine would not have profited from books they wrote under these new guidelines. So new statutes are limited to convicted offenders, and they exclude material in which references to the crime are tangential. And that wraps up the chapter on impact of homicide.